And just by show of hands, who's heard of floating or float house or floating? Oh, yes! That is awesome. Okay, I didn't expect that. Okay, I mean, we push Facebook marketing pretty hard, so if you saw us there, that's probably why. But for those who didn't raise their hands, and for maybe people watching the video, just a synopsis, floating is a practice. It's a practice where you enter into a flotation tank. It's also known as a sensory deprivation tank or an isolation tank. And basically, it's this giant bathtub-like contraption. And it's like the world's most perfect bathtub because you can actually fully stretch out in it. You're not crumpled up into like a paperclip. And we put about 10 inches of water, and we put 900 pounds of pharmaceutical-grade Epsom salts diluted into the solution. So once you lie in it, you actually float effortlessly. On top of that, the water is heated to the same temperature as the surface of your skin. So once you settle into the solution and you're still, it's hard to tell where your body ends and the water begins. That boundary starts to dissolve, and it's actually a really unique experience. The tank itself is encapsulated, but it's very voluminous. You have lots of space in there, and actually when the door's closed, it's pitch black. It's actually light-proof, so you can't see anything. And in fact, you can't really feel anything because you're not touching the sides or the bottom, so your perceptions are much more expansive than constricting. And finally, your ears are under the water with earplugs. So the point of the whole environment is to minimize as much sensory input coming into your nervous system as possible. And you can see we have lots of stimulation in our world, in our culture, in our city. And the float tank is an amazing, unique therapeutic modality to take all that away for 90 minutes. And we choose 90 minutes because that actually matches our circadian rhythms, our sleep cycles. And it's a more natural biorhythm that way. The float tank is a very unique space for cultivating internal awareness. So naturally, when we take away the external world, which we're very much kind of drawn to, we're always being pulled out of our bodies, out of ourselves. It lets us go inside and to experience what's left. And typically, what we feel is our breath, obviously, our heart rate, which I'm feeling right now, and then more non-physical things. Our thoughts become square right in your face. And your emotions are kind of right there too. You can kind of feel all these things on a whole more personal level. It's like kind of going on an intimate date with yourself. And these are the slides that are all the same because I wanted to illustrate at this point how in our culture we're super overstimulated. And we actually rely on the stress response to get us through our day-to-day lives. And I don't think this is the healthiest way to live. The float tank actually induces a very strong relaxation response in our body by activating our parasympathetic nervous system. So our central nervous system has two branches, our peripheral nervous system and our autonomic nervous system. And then the autonomic nervous system has two more branches, which are the sympathetic nervous system, also known as the fight or flight or stress response, and the parasympathetic nervous system. And coincidentally, the float tank lets to suppress the stress response. And so all your adrenaline, epinephrine, cortisol, all those things become flushed out and reduced, while we jack up things like endorphins and dopamine, all endogenously produced. So when you come out of a float, you feel very light, you feel very spacious, and we're not really used to this. And sometimes in the float tank, it can be a little difficult. We're not used to being that isolated with ourselves, but I think that's a red flag. And another red flag that I want to illustrate too is how much, as a culture, we kind of rely on stimulants, especially coffee. I don't think we're meant to be in that state that long. And in fact, all of these stress hormones are very catabolic. So that means they break tissues down. And if you're chronically exposed to a stress response, then you're more susceptible to lots of different diseases. Your immune system becomes suppressed. So our culture is very focused on this alert, problem-solving state of consciousness. And Graham Hancock, who's an author, put it really well in a TED Talk called The War on Consciousness, where we're not used to the more creative daydream side of ourselves that we kind of restrict and we don't really foster and create. And that's the two-pronged effect of being in a float tank, is it has this massive physiological relaxation response, but it also has this very unique psychological response. You start to slow down your brain waves, and you go into this more creative, holistic, almost mystical experience sometimes for some people. And everyone's different. The variable really is the individual and not the environment. And I just wanted to wrap this up. Last week we had Dr. Gabor Mate on a podcast we also host. It's called Vancouver Real. And we haven't aired this episode yet, but he, if you don't know who he is, I strongly suggest you YouTube him or Google him because his videos they're amazing. And he was just spewing out wisdom for 2 hours with us. It was awesome. And he said something that I want to share with you. He goes, as the contradictions of society become more and more clear and as life becomes more difficult for a lot of people, there is just a search for truth. The more falsehood there is, the more people are seeking the truth. And then he went on to further quote Karl Marx, in that each society creates inside its own belly the forces that eventually will transform it. And I believe this is kind of the state where we're in with this hyper-alert, analytical culture that we're in. And we all need to chill out a little bit and get enough flow time. Thank you very much. Enjoy the rest of the talk.